Hey, we're getting ready to start with the second part of the Chapter 5 lecture about the Roman Republic. Just getting my computer set up here after monitoring test for somebody. It should be up and running for you all anyway. Uh, we left off with finishing out this slide, talking about how the plebeian council or the plebeian assembly was created in 471 BC to finally give some representation to the vast majority of the Roman population. Because up until this point, only the patricians had had any say in how the republic was run. Now, while they do have the plebeian assembly, the plebeian assembly at this point didn't have a lot of authority. It was basically, I mean, you can look at what happened in 471. It was kind of like the patricians said, "Oh, okay, the plebeians, they feel like they need a voice. So what we'll do is we'll create a popular assembly for them, but we really won't give them any authority." And over the next 2 decades, the plebeians begin to realize if they want to really have a voice in the republic, they're going to have to understand the law. Uh, the problem with that is that Roman law had not been codified. It hadn't been written down, categorized, had the legal system cleaned up. Uh, you know, you would just have, certain elders in local communities that would have memory of the laws, but nothing had ever been published before. So finally, in 450 BC, at the urging of members of the plebeian assembly, you end up having the construction of the 12 tables of law. Now, this was a collection of all of the legal standards throughout, laws throughout the Roman Republic at this time. And while it would be placed on, large bronze tablets in the center of the city of Rome, you would have copies made that would be distributed to other, maybe not necessarily every small community throughout the Roman Republic, but any other population centers, any other larger urban settlements would have a copy of the 12 tables of law. Basically anywhere where a significant population center that would have a court that, judges that would handle local disputes, there would be a copy of the 12 tables somewhere in that town, in that city, where the people could look over them and educate themselves on what the laws were throughout Rome. After they start to see the actual laws of the Republic, this is when the plebeians start to truly realize, not just a few educated individuals, but the population at large. Because again, the plebeian class, only two social classes in Rome, the plebeian class starts to realize how underprivileged they were. And it's a slow process. We're talking about over the course of hundreds of years, things changing, but they start to make advances, maybe never truly becoming equals to the patricians, but they start gaining privileges as time goes on. The 12 tables were published in 450 BC. Well, 5 years later, plebeians are finally allowed to intermarry with patricians. Up until 445, it was illegal for plebeians to marry into the patrician class. Then the next big advance you're going to see is not going to come until 367 BC. This is when it becomes legal for plebeians to hold the consulship. It doesn't mean that there's going to be a plebeian consul anytime soon, which leads to the next big advance 25 years later, but it makes it legal for a plebeian to hold the consulship. Before 367, you had to be a patrician to run for consul. 367 BC, it's now legal for plebeians to run for consul, but in a lot of cases, it's going to end up being a situation where a patrician candidate is going to have the money, they're going to have the political backing, where they'll be able to call in favors and pull votes to make sure that they get elected, where a plebeian politician isn't necessarily going to have those same connections. So it's legal and it's possible for a plebeian to serve as consul, but it doesn't mean that it's going to happen anytime soon. And because there were so few plebeian consuls over the next 25 years, in 342 BC, a law was passed that stipulated that both consuls could be plebeian, but one consul had to come from the plebeian class to make sure that, again, 75% of the population of the Roman Republic was plebeian. 342, it only makes sense that the 3/4 majority of the Republic be represented at the highest level. 287 BC, you have the passage of what was known as Hortensian Law. All laws passed by the plebeian council, Council of the Plebs, plebeian assembly, all the different names for the same thing. Hortensian Law meant that any legislation passed by the Council of the Plebs applied to all Roman citizens. Up until 287 BC, when I said that the plebeian assembly, the Council of the Plebs, didn't have a lot of authority, that's because they were a popular assembly, but they only, until 287, until Hortensian Law was passed, plebeian legislation only applied to plebeians. Plebeian legislation did not apply to any member of the patrician class. It was like the two different social classes in Rome had two separate laws or two separate legal codes that applied to them. And that's another problem, is that patricians could pass legislation in some of the other assemblies, and those laws applied to the plebeian people, but laws that plebeians voted on didn't apply to patricians. So now with Hortensian Law, it's a two-way street. Next thing we're going to look at is the expansion of the Roman Republic. First, the expansion of the Romans throughout the Italian peninsula, and then we'll start to look at the expansion of the Republic outside of Italy itself. And by the end of this chapter, we'll be moving into how the Roman Republic ends up becoming an imperial setup, and you had the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. In terms of the conquest of Italy, going back to 509 is when the Republic was founded. So we're looking at here, within less than 2 decades, the people of Rome and the surrounding farmland, as they start to look to expand outside of just the settlement of Rome, they start creating alliances with some of the other Latin communities in the immediate area. And this is really when you see the Republic begin to take shape. Then you jump forward another 150 years. The next significant event in terms of the growth of the Republic would be in 343, and then run for several decades, all the way up until 290 BC. Continuous struggles with the Samnites south of the Roman Republic. And it would be a case where the Romans would push into a region to the south, and the Samnites would retaliate and drive the Romans out. Or if the Romans make a gain in one area, the Samnites would push north and seize some other Roman territory, and then the Romans would end up having to take that territory back. And when they pulled the troops out of the region they had just conquered to retake their own land, the Samnites would take back And it really was. It was just a push and pull between these two groups for the better part of 50 years. As they eventually defeat the Samnites, absorb that territory into the Republic. As they push farther south, they're going to start coming into contact with the settlements that the Greeks had established in southern Italy. Pyrrhus of Epirus ends up being defeated by the Romans twice, but in both cases, they were very costly wars for the Romans. And to this day, if you ever hear somebody make reference to, they got what they wanted, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, it means that, yes, I won, but in the grand scheme of things, I paid a higher price, or I lost more than I gained in victory. The Romans did end up gaining land, but they lost thousands of troops in the battles with the armies of Epirus. Eventually the Romans are going to win out, even though, and it's heavy losses on the Roman side. It was heavy losses on the side of the kingdom or the city-state of Epirus. They do defeat the Romans the first two times, cost them very heavily. Then when the Romans make that the third surge, pushing into this Greek territory, this time the Romans, and that's another thing about the Romans, is when they set their sights as an army, as a political force, when they set their sights on a goal, militarily, when they set their sights on a territory, they really weren't going to take accept failure as an option. You have a situation where the costs were very heavily. They got defeated twice as they started pushing south into this Greek territory, but they're going to come back for a third surge, and the third time they will have adapted. They will examine what their weaknesses were, what caused them to lose in the first two struggles with Pyrrhus, and they'll make the necessary changes. They'll come back and attack differently, defend differently, and the third time was a charm, so to speak. The Romans end up winning the third battle, and they end up conquering that territory. Again, drawing it into the Republic, into the Roman Confederation. Now, the Roman Confederation was devised to rule all this land that the Romans were picking up. Some were allowed to become some people were allowed to full Roman citizenship. Others have the top tier would have been people drawn into the Republic, the Confederation, that are allowed full citizenship. The next tier down would be allies of the Republic. They would have some privileges, but they wouldn't have Roman citizenship. They wouldn't have full rights. Then you also had territories that, some of those provinces on the outer edges of the Republic, they are going to be ones where those people, they're going to have to earn their citizenship. Those provinces on the outer edges of the Republic, they've been conquered by the Romans, and the home population, the native population of those regions, they're going to have to prove their loyalty to Rome, their usefulness to Rome. And if they do so, individuals could potentially gain citizenship and all the rights that come with that. As the Romans expand, they would end up building fortified cities along the, up and down, east and west around the peninsula. They would construct roads like they learned how to from the Etruscans to connect these fortified cities. So that way, what the roads ended up doing is the roads made it easier, especially as we're in this period of Republican growth. the frontiers were always a concern. And at this point, it connects the settlements, the fortifications throughout the peninsula, and it creates easy travel, fast travel for troop movements. When you start out with the Republic in the center of Italy, and then they're pushing north and they're pushing south, it's very important to be able to move the troops where you need them. If you start pushing to the south and you've got the majority of your troops in the south, yet on the frontier there are attacks by your northern neighbors, or some of the provinces in the north start to revolt against Roman rule, you have to be able to get soldiers quickly to those problem areas. That was the significance. That was the purpose of building these, the amount of effort, the amount of work they put into building these roads. It wasn't just for trade. It wasn't just for people to be able to travel easily. It was specifically for the ease of movement for the military. Because, make no mistake about it, the Romans understood that at times when alliances couldn't be forged, when they're gonna go to war and they're going to conquer territory, you're gonna have to make sure that you can mobilize your military force easily and efficiently to maintain control. Very consistent. That's another thing about the Romans, is the consistency of the Roman Republic. It wasn't just the Republic will continue to expand. The Romans were very opportunistic. When they saw a situation that might allow for growth, then they're going to do so. Whether it was through what they viewed as, if they were going to have to go to war, they wanted to make sure that it's something that the Roman legions would be able to easily take care of. They would prefer alliances because that's not going to be a strain on human or financial resources the same way that a war would. But it wasn't like there was always a constant push to expand the Republic. Okay, we took this, well, now we got to take this. No, they would wait until the time was right. When they saw an opening, when they saw a opportunity, they would take that. They would do the most to maximize that opportunity to expand the borders of the Republic. After they gained control of most, if not all, of the Italian peninsula, then they're going to start to look to expand throughout the Mediterranean, especially the Western Mediterranean. As they start to do this very quickly, they're going to come into contact with a group of individuals we've already talked about here, the Carthaginians. Remember, I talked about how Carthage had been one of the early, and we're talking several hundred years earlier, a settlement, a colony, if you would, founded by the Phoenicians around 800 BC. So, the founding of the city of Carthage predated the earliest possible founding of Rome, even as fishing villages, by about 50 years. Carthage controlled much of the Western Mediterranean world. Again, the Phoenicians were seafaring people, so they controlled trade. They had a strong navy, but they also had strong land military forces as well. Again, the Phoenician focal point, 800 BC, you had Sidon, Byblos, and Tyre in the Eastern Mediterranean, which were the parent cities. Carthage ends up being a colony. By the time we get to 300 BC, definitely by the time I'm talking about here, 264 BC, Carthage was the center of the Phoenician world. They had, the same way that the Greeks had begun to settle several centuries earlier, southern part of Italy, the island of Sicily, Corsica, in the Western Mediterranean. What you're going to see with Carthage is they have even more of a presence in the Western Mediterranean. The northwestern coast of Africa, the southern and eastern coast of Spain, even a little bit maybe, just a couple of small settlements, maybe in the southern Mediterranean coast of France, but any islands in the Western Mediterranean. A lot of times you would see, like the island of Sicily, the eastern half of the island was settled and controlled by the Greeks and eventually the Romans, and the western half of the island was controlled by the Carthaginians. Now, as Rome has been expanding throughout the Italian peninsula, of course, once they conquer the southern part, the boot part of Italy, that brings them in close proximity to the island of Sicily. Eventually, as they gain control of the southern, what's going to become the Kingdom of Naples eventually, and the southern end of the boot and Sicily are very close together. It would be a very short boat trip to the island of Sicily. Of course, they're going to start, very quickly looking to expand to that island. As they do, of course, they come into contact with the Greeks on the island of Sicily. And as they explore the waters around the entire island, that's going to bring them into contact with the Carthaginians. Of course, they already knew who the Carthaginians were, because again, Carthage was a great power in the Western Mediterranean. So as the Romans have begun to expand, now they're afraid of the people of Carthage expanding into Roman territory. This is going to turn into a long, drawn-out struggle for dominance, in the Mediterranean world, specifically in the western side. Eventually, the Romans will start looking to expand to the east and deal with the Greeks. But at this point, 264 up to 133 BC, this is the struggle is going to be for the western half of the Mediterranean, and it's going to be broken down into 3 separate wars at different points. Now, you look here, I've been talking about the roads that the Romans built. This is an actual photograph of the Appian Way and the way that the road, just to give you an idea of how the roads were constructed. Like I said, there is still, this is it right here, the Via Appia. There's still about 300 miles of the Appian Way. I don't know exactly how far it's intact, but this picture here is to give you an example of how extensive the road system just within the Italian peninsula was. As the Roman Republic, as the empire ends up growing beyond the Italian peninsula, the Romans are still going to continue to build roads connecting major settlements, but in the Italian peninsula, these roads that they built, they crisscrossed and made it to where, where you see what looks like these little veiny looking roads, there would be smaller, it's just that this map only shows you the biggest settlements in Italy at this point. There would be smaller settlements that were connecting, or fortifications that were connecting to the city of Rome. There's a saying that says all roads lead to Rome. Well, that's because Rome was the center of the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, and they built these roads to connect all of their settlements. So yes, eventually all of the roads, one way or another, if you live in Genoa, you could go directly to Rome down the coast on the west, or you could start to head east and then you could travel to Bologna, go down to Rome that way, or from Bologna continue to the east coast. And once you hit this junction here, then you could travel to Rome that way. This illustration here shows you the amount of effort that they went into in terms of building a road. You would have the flagstones on the top, and to keep them from shifting and moving around, the space in between the stones would be filled with very small gravel, dirt, things like that, to keep them from shifting, to create some solidity. Then you would have a trench dug 3 to 4 feet deep, and in that trench to allow for drainage so water didn't stand on the roads. You would have a situation where you have, sand, then you would have small rocks, then you would have slightly larger pieces of gravel, then you'd have larger rocks filling out the bottom of this trench. So what happens is, as it rains, water is going to seep down through the different strata that make up this road. And it's going to allow things to dry out faster. It's going to keep water from pooling. Another thing that you see here, another thing that the Romans start to do with their roads, especially as the road network really starts to expand, is they start putting these pylons down. And we still use this technique on a lot of our roads here in the United States today. Mile markers. If you know that it is 23 miles, which it's not, this would be hundreds of miles from Rome to Genoa, then it would have a number on this mile marker. And it, kind of like our road signs, sometimes you see the little green signs off to the side of the road that just says, 23 or 209 or whatever. But then we also have the green signs that will say, like from here, so many miles to Irvington, so many miles to Louisville, going west, so many miles to Hallsville, to Lewisport, to Owensboro. The Romans would put things like that on these posts. And there might be posts literally every mile, or maybe every 5 miles, every 10 miles, they would end up putting the distances to different locations, generally measuring from the city of Rome. But that was just to give you a little bit of illustration about what I talked about with the roads earlier. Now, in terms of the struggle with Carthage and the Phoenicians, this series of conflicts are referred to as the Punic Wars. The reason that they're called Punic Wars is because of the Latin word for Phoenician, Punicus. I mean, that's simply the reason why they don't refer to them as Carthaginians, just like people from the city of Rome were Romans. But as the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire takes shape, everybody that lives in the Republic is referred to as a Roman. It wasn't that way with Carthage. If you lived in Carthage, you were Carthaginian. But ethnically, you were Phoenician. So the Romans refer to them using their own language, Latin. Instead of calling them the Phoenician Wars, they called it the Punic Wars. Now, Rome ends up sending an army into Sicily. Now, regardless of what the Romans might have claimed, they said that they were sending an army in to settle a dispute between two Sicilian cities that were under Roman control. But they sent an entire army in to put down what was honestly a local dispute. Because the Romans marched an entire army into the island of Sicily and Carthage held colonies or settlements on the other half of that island, the government in Carthage considered this an act of war. So you have open conflict between the two nations, and that's exactly what the Romans were shooting for. They thought, we'll kind of get our foot in the door here. Maybe we'll fight over the island of Sicily itself. Once we drive the Carthaginians out of Sicily, then we might look at possibly the island of Corsica. Then we might look at expanding into other parts of the far western Mediterranean, in Spain, southern France, maybe even North Africa. We'll just wait and see how things go. The war drags on for several years. Both sides get involved, not just on the island of Sicily, but both civilizations, navies end up getting involved. Both sides won and lost major battles along the coast, and it does expand beyond Sicily. They start fighting in North Africa. They start fighting in Spain. For the most part, at this point, you don't have any real fighting in Rome or in Italy itself, the island of Sicily. But again, Rome knew what it was doing. That was to get their foot in the door into Carthage's territory, and then they quickly expand the conflict into the rest of Carthage's territory, North Africa and eastern Spain. 241 BC, Carthage ends up pushing for peace, pushing for a treaty, definitely not an alliance with the Romans, but a peace treaty to end the conflict. They were forced to give up all of their holdings on the island of Sicily, and this basically amounts to a timeout. They stopped fighting for a period of time, but Carthage fully expected to have problems with Rome in the future, and Rome fully expected to create problems for Carthage in the future. Just 3 years later, again, very opportunistic, the Romans end up seeing a weak point in Carthage, or in the power structure. They see problems within the Carthaginian government, and they move in to take the islands of Corsica and Sardinia. Well, since they invaded Carthaginian territory, this ensures that another conflict is coming. It doesn't come immediately, but it's coming. Following the war, Carthage recovers from the damage that it suffered fighting against the Romans for well over 20 years under the leadership of a man named Hamilcar Barca. His goal, while he ran the government in Carthage, was to further expand their colonies, their holdings in Spain, not just for territory, but also manpower. And he continues to build up the military. He was just as much a military leader as he was a politician. And he wants to build up their military to protect the existing holdings of Carthage in Spain and southern France and North Africa. But also, I can guarantee you that his intention was eventually not just that he expected trouble from the Romans, but if he had to, he might create a little trouble of his own. Now, in 221 BC, his son, Hannibal, ends up taking over for his father, and within 3 years, Rome and Carthage are back to, into an active conflict once again. Hannibal, of course, had been raised by his father. He saw the Romans just outright, no exception, as the enemy. And as soon as he takes over for his father, he continues the military buildup. He has been creating plans, probably with his father before he took his place, for a potential invasion of Rome. I mean, the Romans invaded the territory of the Carthaginians in the previous conflict. Why not do that to the Romans themselves? Rome and Carthage end up dividing Spain into spheres of influence. Essentially, Rome took control of the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula, and Carthage ends up controlling the southern half of Spain, or what would become the nation of Spain later down the road. But then the Romans, again, being opportunistic, it's not just, oh, I see this happening over here, we're going to take advantage of that. They'll create opportunities. Since you had Roman settlements in the north, Carthaginian settlements in the south, instead of marching an army over the border into those Carthaginian Spanish settlements, Romans would send individuals, maybe 2 or 3, not necessarily spies, but they were sent there as agents of the Roman government to sow discord, to create problems for the Carthaginians. Of course, the Spanish in the southern half of Spain had been conquered by Carthage, and these Romans are sneaking across into Carthaginian territory, and they're trying to push the natives into rebelling against Carthaginian rule. Of course, after a couple of these Roman agents are captured, they find out what the plan was. Hannibal's not waiting for the Romans to strike first. He considers this an act of war, so he goes on the offensive against the Romans. 218 BC, again, 3 years after Hannibal takes over for his father, because Hannibal had struck out against some of the Roman colonial settlements in northern Spain, the Roman government takes that as an aggressive action by the Carthaginians. So they try to spin it to the point, even though Roman agents are the ones that started the whole issue, the Roman government declares war on Carthage because Carthaginian troops had marched into Roman territory and attacked Roman settlements. Like I said, Hannibal had plans that he wasn't going to let all this fighting take place on Carthaginian territory. He was going to take the fight directly to the Romans. He had put together a massive army, about 30 to 40,000 men, cavalry. He had about 6,000 horses. He also had divisions or units that used elephants. I've already talked a little bit about, the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucid dynasty in, after Alexander the Great, and this would have been, a little over 100 years after Alexander the Great had passed away. So those Hellenistic kingdoms in the Near East were definitely very active at this point. The Carthaginians had adopted the use of elephants on the battlefield. So this was something that the Romans didn't have. Elephants were like tanks on the ancient battlefield. And he marches this army of 30 to 40,000 men, 6,000 horses, hundreds of elephants across the Alpine mountains in southern Europe into the Italian peninsula. And just think about how difficult that would be to move that many men, thousands of horses, and hundreds of elephants through dangerous mountain passes. I mean, he lost some men, he lost some of the livestock moving through the mountains, but then, to the dismay of the Romans, now they have armies, riding on the backs of elephants, trampling all over northern Italy, attacking Roman outposts, and the Romans don't have any way. They don't have any way to counter elephants on the battlefield. What the Romans end up doing is they would just harass Hannibal's army. They didn't really have a way to combat the units that he was bringing. The Romans didn't really use cavalry a great deal. They used infantry, foot soldiers. They didn't have anything close to elephants in the Roman legions. So what they would do is, as Hannibal's armies were moving from one settlement to another settlement, the Romans using their roads, allowing for fast movement, fast deployment of the military, they end up attacking, just like setting up an ambush, attacking Hannibal's army, and then they flee. They flee to the closest Roman fort. Well, these forts were built to withstand sieges. Hannibal's army wasn't built for siege warfare, to make camp around a walled, defended location and try to find a way to bring those walls down. So the Roman soldiers would attack Hannibal's army, then they would withdraw, they would hide in a defended position. Hannibal didn't have a way to break down the gates, break down the walls, so the only option he had was to go find, take his army, destroy a few farms in the countryside, and then head to the next fort that he could find, trying to find somebody that would fight him on an open battlefield, and the Romans just wouldn't do it. This goes on for 2 years. Basically, Hannibal's army just keeps riding all over, north, south, east, west, through the Italian peninsula, trying to find when they did face the Romans on an open battlefield, they did crush the Romans. In 216 at the Battle of Cannae, the Romans lost 40,000 men because they got tired of these skirmish tactics, make a little attack, withdraw, run behind, hide behind your city walls. And then when Hannibal left, the army would come, that army would come back out and they would start pursuing Hannibal, hit him from behind, and then they'd run to another fortification. Then when Hannibal turns to pursue them, then the army would come out of this fort that he was initially heading to. They would attack them. They'd withdraw back within their fortified city. 216, the Romans decide to confront Hannibal's army directly, and they lost as many men as Hannibal brought to Italy. Because the Romans lost so many tens of thousands of legionnaires, you start to see some of the people that the Romans had conquered to the south, whether it was the Samnites, whether it was Greeks, they start to rebel against Roman rule. Well, then the Romans realize, okay, we can't fight Hannibal directly, but we can put these revolts down. So they use their military forces in the south. They continue to harass Hannibal in the north, keep him occupied, running back and forth, trying to find somebody to fight. Then they send military forces to the south to put down those revolts. They eventually restore order in the south, but Hannibal just rides around the countryside with his army, destroying whatever that they can find. But the Romans, after the Battle of Cannae, the Romans do not fight Hannibal's forces, head up, man to man, on an open battlefield. What they do end up doing is, knowing how big Hannibal's army is, knowing through the use of cavalry, through the use of the elephants, what they do know is he moves slowly. And they know that he's not going to be able to transport all these horses, these elephants, over sea. If he was going to do that, they would have traveled by boat from North Africa into southern Italy, and they would have gotten there that way, instead of trying to bring an army from Spain through southern France, through the Alpine mountains, and then down into Italy. So what the Romans do is they load up thousands of soldiers. They sell them across the Mediterranean to the west, and they start attacking Carthaginian settlements in Spain. 206 BC, in 206 BC, I left the BC off there, but this is still centuries before the birth of Christ. Scipio Africanus the Elder ends up pushing the Carthaginians all the way completely out of Spain, because Hannibal, he can't get his army back across the mountains. His plan is to bring Rome to its knees, and he can't do that if he has to take his army back to Spain or to Gaul even. He's waiting to fight the Romans there in Italy. So Rome takes control of Spain. The next thing that Scipio Africanus does is he ends up setting his sights on North Africa, which, the reason that we call it Africa now is based off of Scipio Africanus. 204 BC, he leads an army from Sicily across the Mediterranean to North Africa. By attacking Carthage directly, or at least landing his army in close proximity to Carthage, that's a big enough threat. Hannibal finally pulls his army out of Italy. They travel back through France or through Gaul down into Spain. They cross the Strait of Gibraltar. They get back into North Africa, and within a couple of years, the Romans gain a foothold in North Africa. But after a few months, Hannibal's army is back in North Africa, and he's ready to fight. If that's where the Romans are going to fight him, then that's where he'll fight the Romans. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, 2 years after the Romans, threatened Carthage directly, Hannibal and his army end up being defeated. The war comes to an end. Now, another thing here is that you have, basically, the Romans want to make sure that Carthage is not going to be a threat to them anytime soon. So after the Battle of Zama, at Carthage, they end up, and you might have heard this phrase before, salting the earth. The farmland around I mean, Carthage is to the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, as important as Rome is to the Romans. What they do with the farmland around Carthage is they till the soil up, just like you were getting ready to plant crops, and then they sow salt. And what that salt basically does, it essentially poisons the ground for any plants that they want to grow with. Such a high sodium content, the the crops that the Carthaginians would have tried to grow are going to end up dying in the fields. So this causes great hardship for the Carthaginians. They are not in any position to mess with the Romans for the foreseeable future. Hannibal, because now he hates the Romans even more than he already did, he starts to serve as a military, a mercenary general willing to lead any armies that are willing to fight the Romans. He fights the Romans, in the Seleucid kingdom, in Bithynia, finally, after defeat after defeat after defeat, because the whole time he's trying to find other people to fight the Romans, the Roman Republic is only getting bigger. The Roman legion is only getting larger, getting stronger. And, the successes he had when he attacked the Italian peninsula, he never has those successes again. After the Battle of Zama, when his army was defeated, he sells his skills, because he had a lot of experience fighting the Romans, and he did have minor successes, but he never defeated the Romans like he sought out to do. Finally, he dishonored. He commits suicide years later. Now, a year after the Battle of Zama, Carthage is forced to sign a peace treaty with the Romans. They lose control of Spain, and they promise not to go to war without okaying it with the Romans first. With any group, they will not make war unless Rome says, okay, we don't have a horse in that race, or we're neutral on the person or the people that you're looking to fight with. So yes, you can go ahead and do it, or no, that's an ally of Rome. You can't fight them. Well, it keeps peace for 50 years. The Third Punic War takes place in 149 to 146 BC. Carthage ends up making war against an ally of Rome in North Africa. That breaks the treaty from 201, and that gives the Romans a reason to come in and wipe the Carthaginians out. They were not the military power that they had been a half century earlier. Like I said, this conflict only takes a handful of years. They destroy the Carthaginian armies, and eventually Carthage ends up being pulled in to becoming a province of the Roman Republic. In terms of the way that the Romans, switching gears here, looking at how the Romans looked at religion in everyday life. Religion was a part of everyday life, just like it was with the Greeks. Again, they pulled very heavily to develop their religious culture from what the Greeks did. Now, another thing that you see with the Romans, especially because they borrowed this religious culture from another civilization, it was more of a, not so much that all Romans were devoted followers of the faith. In a lot of cases, it might have just been for appearances, that it was a social thing. It's what good Romans were expected to do. So you put on a show, and you made offerings, and you went to public events and festivals of a religious nature. But religion was a part of everyday life, like it had been with the Greeks. Again, as the Romans come into more contact with the Greeks, this is when they start to draw more and more in creating their own religious culture. They draw very heavily from the Greeks. The Romans were generally tolerant of any religious cults. That's another thing about the Romans being very practical as a society, as a government. They knew that people, devout cultures, devoutly religious cultures, would fight for their religious beliefs to the death. So as long as they didn't deem a group's religious beliefs as a threat to Roman rule, they allowed those groups to continue to, practice their religious beliefs as they saw fit. Only occasionally did they outlaw religious cults or groups, early Christians being one of the ones that they did outlaw. But when they started conquering territory in the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean, for the most part, they didn't have a problem with the Jewish people. And of course, the first Christians were people that broke off from the Jewish faith. And again, the reason that Christianity was deemed illegal is because the Roman government at the time, of course, that would have been under the imperial government. Christians and in a lot of cases, their misunderstood beliefs were deemed a threat. That's why that was illegal. But the practice of various other religions in the Middle East or in North Africa, throughout mainland Europe, that's why they weren't necessarily outlawed. Again, ritual was very important to Roman religion. Even if they weren't devoutly religious, you still had to maintain a proper relationship with the gods and make, kind of like religious, important religious holidays. Certain rituals had to be followed. It was just part of their social construct. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief pontiff or chief religious leader, I'm not going to talk about them very much here. You can actually look on page 119 in the 6th edition of our textbook. If you look under the heading of social and society and culture in the Roman Republic, you can also read up on a little more detail about the Pontifex Maximus and the role of the Vestal Virgins in the religious aspect of Roman culture. The College of Augurs was responsible for interpreting signs or omens, warnings from the gods. Again, it depended on the individual consul or praetor or senator as to whether they believed in omens or not, but still, before a magistrate made a major political decision or made a took military action, generally the magistrates would consult with the College of Augurs just to see what the omens said. Basically, again, even if they didn't believe, it was paying due respect as, they were seeking the God's approval. Just like with Greece, again, religious festivals are a major event in the Roman Republic. These festivals, it was a reason to party, and sometimes these religious festivals would last for days, if not a week, maybe even 2 weeks, depending on what the festival was, which god it represented. And again, the Romans, if they weren't especially religious, they definitely took advantage of these festivals, because especially the larger festivals, the Roman society would basically shut down. Businesses would close, government offices would close. You wouldn't see any of the legislative assemblies meeting during those festivals. People were supposed to go out and, live it up. In terms of the educational system in the Roman Republic, there was no system of public education like in the Golden Age in Rome. You would have private tutors. Again, the Roman system of education drew very heavily from what they had witnessed interacting with the Greeks. The family would provide a child with all the knowledge necessary to be a good Roman citizen. Boys were expected to learn, especially if they lived in the countryside away from urban areas. They were expected to learn the basics of farming, physical skills that would make them good soldiers, because if you were a citizen, you were expected to serve in the military, and for the longest time, you had to be a Roman citizen. You had to hold citizenship to be able to serve in the Roman army. They needed to have This is something they got from the Greeks. They needed to have a basic knowledge of history, or at least specifically the history of Rome. They needed to understand civics. They needed to understand how the Roman government worked, because in addition to serving militarily, especially if you were a patrician, you were expected to serve in the government as well. The more important, the wealthier, the more powerful your family was, the higher level of government you were expected to serve in. Girls, they were expected to learn the skills necessary to be a good wife, a good mother. A lot like the Greeks, women were looked at like second-class citizens in the Roman Republic. And now, if you came from the plebeian class, if you were a commoner, yes, you needed to learn how to take care of the household, how to, take care of children and be a good mother, how to serve your husband and be a good wife. If you came from a patrician family, especially on a large agricultural estate like a plantation in the country, or if you came from a patrician family in the city, the wife would have servants. And in terms of the skills necessary, in addition to being a good wife, a good mother, a lot of times the wife would be in charge of running the estate, the household, the farm day to day, because her husband might be traveling, might be serving in the army, different things could come up. So if you came from the upper class in the Republic, you might have additional duties other than just being a wife and a mother. All upper class children, male or female, were expected to be literate. They were expected to know how to read and write. If you came from the plebeian class, especially if you lived in the countryside, that was not an expectation. But all patrician children were expected to be literate and honestly, to have a fairly extensive formal education. Increased contact with the Greeks caused wealthy Romans to want their children to be exposed to the Greek studies, because the reputation, because of how the Romans held certain aspects of Greek culture in such high esteem. If your family had enough money, you would either hire Greek tutors to come live in your household and teach your children, or you might even pay to send your children abroad to different Greek settlements in Greece itself, not Greek settlements, in southern Italy, but you might send your son to study in Athens or Corinth or Thebes. And, because by this point, the Greeks were moving towards having formal schools as opposed to just philosophers serving as private tutors. So if you had enough money, you might send your children to Greece to study, but at the very least, you wanted to make sure that you hired a private tutor that was well versed in the topics, in the subject areas that the Greeks placed emphasis on. Rhetoric, again, if you come from a wealthy family, you're expected to serve a role in politics. Part of being a politician is speaking in front of crowds of people. So rhetoric, persuasive speaking, public speaking is something that was very important in the eyes of upper class Romans. Philosophy, mainly the philosophic school of Stoicism, that was the only real Greek philosophical outlook that the Romans attached themselves to and really adopted into Roman culture. Stoicism, because it already fell in line with something that was important to the Roman people: service to your community, service to the republic itself. Like I said, if you were going to pursue a political career, you had to be able to speak eloquently in front of groups. You had to be persuasive. To win elections, a lot of politicians also served as lawyers. Same thing, you got to be able to make a good persuasive argument to be a successful courtroom lawyer. Now, as the educational process focused on knowledge of Greek subjects, by the time you get to the first century BC, educated Romans are becoming increasingly bilingual. Even though the language of the Roman people and the Roman Republic is Latin, what showed that you had an extensive formal education was if you could also speak Greek, if you could speak Egyptian, if you could speak, Phoenician. and also being able to read and write in those other languages as well. But Greek was the one where, if you had a formal education and you wanted to show how well you were educated, the more fluent you were in speaking and reading and writing Greek, that was a sign of how well educated your family had taken care of your education. Forgot the word there. Last thing I want to talk about in this video is the evolution of Roman law. I've already talked about the establishment of the 12 tables and specifically looked at the breakthroughs that the plebeian class had after they began to learn the laws of Rome. Mention the 12 tables here again in 450 BC. Once the 12 tables of law are published, that puts the legal code of the Republic in writing there for everyone to see, and there wouldn't be a follow-up to the 12 tables until 1,000 years later, the mid 6th century AD. So you're going from 450 BC to around 550 BC on into 600 before another emperor, well, and by this point it was an emperor. The Byzantine Empire was also referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire. Eventually the Roman Empire would get so big it would split in half. You'd have the Western Empire, which was the Roman Empire, and you'd have the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire. But the Byzantine emperor in the 6th century AD, Justinian, he ends up recodifying, because again, over 1,000 years, tons of laws were passed. And when you have laws that were written in 420 BC and you have laws that were written in 420 AD and they conflict with each other, well, some people might be looking at old legal codes and they're still going by these laws that are 800 years old in some cases. So finally, in the mid 6th century AD, Justinian orders his lawyers, his advisors, to go through and basically clean up the empire's legal system, and they do away with all of the old laws that they could find that had been replaced but never stricken from the records. The next time that you're going to see anything, major changes before Justinian, but that was the first time where you have a recodification or a reorganization of Roman law. Now, a lot of times the Romans, they focused a great deal on trends that we still see today in the modern legal system, depending on past precedent. Records being keeping during a wow, it's getting kind of late in the day and I've been making videos the whole time. It's getting kind of hard to talk sometimes. Whenever you see the new laws being passed, when you see court cases, records being kept during a court proceeding, they recorded how a court case plays out, how the judge decided in a certain case, and they used past precedent. Well, the case that I am representing here is very similar to this case that occurred 17 years ago or 6 months ago. And looking through these records, lawyers do the same thing today to reinforce their argument in court. They will look through past cases. They will find examples of past precedent to say, this is the case that I'm making. The reason that you should find my client innocent or you should find their client guilty is because this time, and this time, over and over again, the courts have decided on similar cases like this in favor of my argument. So it was very important to the Romans to keep legal records and to study past legal records. Now, if you want to look at literature and art during this time period in the Republic, again, in the 6th edition of the book, you can look on pages 123 to 125. I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here, and we will pick up with the next video, probably the last video for chapter 5. talking about the decline and fall of the Republic and setting the stage for the development, the emergence of the Roman Empire. Now, again, like I say in all the videos, if you have any questions, you need clarification about anything, please don't hesitate to contact me, email me, make a comment on the Google Classroom. And, you know, if you need something more face-to-face than just an explanation on paper or an electronic explanation, again, feel free to jump into the Google Meets. My office hours, you know, from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock every day. And sometimes I might deviate from that schedule. If it says that it's supposed to be a European history hour, well, if you jump into the European history Google Meet and I'm not there, click on the link for the U.S. history or the history of rock and roll meet, just to make sure that I'm not in one of those meet rooms, because I might have had a request for somebody and not even thinking about what the schedule said. Okay, today is office hour is supposed to be for European history, but if it's a U.S. history office hour and you have a question about European history, don't hesitate, don't wait, because if you wait, you might forget and you never ask the question. If it's a U.S. history day and you have a question about European history, go ahead and jump into the U.S. history Google Meet and, you know, talk to me about whatever it is, whatever issue has come up, and we'll see if we can get it taken care of. Well, like I said, I'll be releasing another video over Chapter 5 later. Once I get all of these done, I will end up putting a link to the playlist for Euro into our Google Classroom. I will see you all later.